Hey, what's going on, guys and gals? Chef PV here, Troy. ATXRC Productions, Zero Ground FPV, all that stuff. Today, we are going to talk about soldering, and I'm going to try to make this as kind of small and quick as possible, but soldering, soldering, all that stuff, right? I don't care how you say it or how I say it. Don't worry about that. Just worry about the skills and the tips and the techniques. I'm not a professional electrician or have any engineering background, really. So soldering for me came, just like many of you, self-taught, watched some videos, and really just did it. And I learned with ground RC, and I say that when really I didn't learn until I got into the aerial game, how important being very good, clean, and the proper techniques actually helped, especially in not blowing components up, which is a key. So I learned and perfected kind of my skills kind of with the aerial stuff, but I'm still not the best, and I do things I'm sure people would say that you shouldn't or not the right technique. But that being said, I just wanted to give you some quick tips and tidbits and some different ways of soldering some things the way I do it. That way you can see for yourself and judge by yourself. So number one rule, good soldering iron. Number one rule is good soldering iron in the sense of it has to have the wattage. The wattage is like the horsepower if you were thinking of like a motor or a car. So the wattage is the amount of power that it can keep the heat constant. So the higher the wattage, the more consistent and constant the heat source will be. So that's really important. The way that soldering irons lose heat, and the reason why the heat is so key, and the tip choice and all of those things, the temperature settings are key, is because a soldering iron is a metal tip, right? So the tip is metal, the whole thing heats up, and then you touch metal. What happens when you take a hot metal and touch a cold metal? The heat dissipates from hot to cold, correct? So you're wicking out all of the heat when you touch things that are trying to be bonded. So what you need is the balance. It's like cooking. It's like everything, man. There's balance. So the balance is the heat of the iron setting, the wattage of the iron, and then the tip selection in accordance to kind of what the joint is that you're trying to flow. So for me, I use basically two tips, and this tip is actually the least used. This is what is considered, I think, and it's got a big bulbous kind of bit on the tip, and I'm sorry the camera is not focusing as well as I'd like. It's got a bit of a tip of a bulbous kind of piece of solder still left on that's like, cold, but it's actually a fine tip. So I use a fine tip, and I also use this one, which is actually, when you look at it, again, I'm sorry it's not, let's see if I can get this to focus. There we go. So this one's a fine tip that has a bit of solder still on it. This one is actually a medium chisel tip. So the medium chisel tip is the one that I use probably 95% of the time. Now the reason why is the chisel tip, the medium one, actually allows me to get a lot of heat to the item and not wick it away too much, so I can kind of work really quickly. But I do have to work at higher temperatures with the bigger tip. And the reason is again, as it wicks it away, you need more power to power it to heat it back up. So really, as you go smaller, you can lower your temperatures, and as you go bigger with your tips and larger with the types of wire that you're working with, you want to go higher. So I'll tell you this, most people operate with this tip, the smaller, medium kind of regular tip, for about a 400 to 500 range for temperature. Now, in setting it 400 to 500, that's going to be really for your small and kind of medium-sized wires. When you get kind of up into like those 12 gauge and stuff like that, you're going to want to raise up the heat. For me, again, probably not the perfect way. I love this tip here because of how versatile it is, this medium chisel. And I use the medium chisel for almost everything. And I run it at about 575 to 620 for small wires. And I run that thing at 780 to 825 for really heavy gauge wires. Again, because I want to really work fast and get everything bonded and jointed and pull back. That being said, heat is a number one damager for things like ESCs. So this ESC over here has all kinds of little gates and little capacitors and resistors and stuff. You heat it up too hot, those things pop or those things give out, and the ESC will not function correctly. Same thing with flight controllers. You heat them up at too much, you're going to burn components out. So you have to have that balance, okay? So that being said, let's hurry up and get to doing some joints. So I am going to actually take off the small tip here because I am going to work with my medium chisel and show you how I do that. And we are going to quickly solder up a couple of different types of joints. So while this heats up, and that's another thing, turn your iron on, set it to the temperature, and let it heat up. You really want this thing to heat up, you know, as much as possible. So here's my iron setup here. I run this Radio Shack setup. It's an awesome setup. It's actually discontinued. For a while it wasn't, but it is now. I only paid like $80 for this about 5 years ago. It has a fuse in the bottom that every once in a while does go out. It's only gone out one time, but don't throw your soldering iron away. Check the fuse. Great thing that it has the sponge pack here. So it's just got a little sponge. You throw a little water on it. That's used to cool the tip. So if you lower your temperature or your temperature is too hot, maybe you're melting the outside of the shrink tubing on the small little 22 gauge wire, well, you're too hot. But you can dab on the wet sponge and it'll cool the tip off really quickly. So that's something you can do that can help keep the temperature right. Personally, the number one thing that I do is this here. The cleaner here, it's a little brass, it's all, I don't know, a little like copper or brass kind of shavings, kind of steel wool, and it cleans the tip. That alone is going to be a huge part of this. You need to be able to clean the tip off properly, and this, I mean, it's like $6 and it lasts forever. It's awesome. So I use that. Besides that, the only other thing you really should think about is flux pins. I'm not going to show those today or use those today. I typically only use them in certain situations. Instead, I do use, and another key is going to be the proper size and proper type of solder. I personally here am using an RA Flux 0.04 is the one that I like, the diameter, 20 gauge, 2.2 flux, and I believe this is a 60/40. Yep. So that's the one I use. So it's got flux in it, and that's why I'm not going to use a flux pin. So we're heated up a little bit here, and one of the ways you can tell if you're hot or not is use this steel wool to try to clean your tip, and if it doesn't come out too shiny, then it's still not hot enough. Another tip would be, is it hot enough yep, it's melting the solder. There you go. So we should definitely be using a fan, but I'm not because of the sound, and I also should be using glasses, or safety glasses, which they're around here, and I really should, but I'm not because I'm not really going to be pulling too many wires apart. But we have all this ready to go. I've got the setting right now at 730. I'm actually going to bump this up because we're going to start by going hot, and we're going to go to 790 with that medium chisel tip again. So here we go. What we're going to start with is tinning of a XT60 and getting it ready. So XT60s, typically they'll sit flat. This one's wanting to move a little bit on me. All right, so here we go. We've got an XT60 connector here, and it's set up in a vice grip because I don't have a vice because the vice is actually holding the camera. So we're going to pre-tin these posts here first. So pre-tinning is when you take solder and you put a little bit of solder onto the item that you're going to be joining together. So we're going to do this both to this XT60 connector, the posts. So we just flooded that one. Now we'll flood the other side. All right, so both of those sides have solder now in them. Now what you're going to do is we need to pre-tin the wires here. So these wires right now have just been, there you go, have just been the shrink tube removed, and they have not been tinned. So these are just raw wires, just been the shrink tubing removed. So now we need to flow some tinning into those. So we'll hold our tip on the wire, and then we'll start flowing in by touching the wire, not the tip. The idea being that the wire heats up to the temperature of the tip, and if it's not heating up to the temperature of the tip, it's not going to flow properly. I'm doing this, it's a little difficult. Typically you would have some helping hands or a vise here, but I'm trying to just do this quick and easy, and all my vices are used up in the moment. So there we go. It's not the cleanest way, but I do have solder all the way flowed into it, and I can see all the way around there's no raw wire spots, so that's good. All right, so now we will, my tip for doing this is to hold the iron to the post and get it flowing first, so get the joint melted and all the solder flowing, and then you can actually touch the wire and drop it into the same post, into the spot. It helps. There we go. Hold it, let it dry or harden, and now we have a nice clean flowed joint. Oh. Need to reposition it a little bit, that's okay. There we go. Nice clean flow. Oh. Just a little hot and I moved. There we go. All right, so now what we need to do is get the wire and join it into the post. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually heat the joint up as we drop in the wire. So we're going to hold it to the joint and then just drop the wire right into the melted, there you go, and then hold it to the wire. 2 seconds and you're good. Now we have a nice flowed joint on. Sorry guys, stupid camera. There we go. And we'll take the positive wire and we'll do the same. There we go. Now it focuses, right? So there's those joints there. So we've got a battery plug. Next, we're going to take and attach the battery plug to a PDB. So we'll need to strip off really quick over here. So now we will flow, pre-tin these wires here. All right, so now we have a PDB board. So once again, great tip would be the medium chisel tip here. And we will use these pads So we need to tin the pads just as we would any other pad or any other wire. Again, pre-tinning is necessary. So we've got the positive and the negative. And we will now, you notice I actually, again, got a little bit of the tinning flowing on the backside, and then I touched the wire on. I'm actually adding a little more just because it wasn't pre-tinned the best. It needed a little more. You'll see sometimes that tinning from pre-tinning soaks out a little bit if you didn't tin the pad enough. So in that case, you can just flow some extra in. There you go. You'll notice that as soon as I'm touching the wires, within 2 seconds or less, it's starting to melt the solder, and that's what you want. It's all about, it should be 3 seconds or less touching, really. 1, 2, 3. If you're not done by then, pull off and you better wait. So there we go. So we now have a PDB set up with that. So now we're going to talk about ESCs and pulling off solder joints from the ESCs. So you have to be very careful. You don't want to pull too hard and snag these things with the pads off. But what you can do is you drop it down with a medium chisel. I'm going to go down to 700. Cool off my tip. And so after cleaning it, all I'm doing is I'm basically touching the joint, waiting for it to melt and pulling it apart. So there we go. Boom. It's one motion very quickly. I just touched it, it melted, I pulled right off. Done. Done. So I just desoldered an ESC that quickly, right? So now you've got a motor that you want to connect to it. This one is actually already, wires are cut, wires are pre-tinned, ready to go. We will go ahead and add a little extra tinning just to make sure. All right, so there you go. And now to wire these back to the ESC, once again, very quickly, touch, let go. If it's not that fast, guys, then you are not doing it right. If your solder joints are not shiny, you have a cold joint. There we go. Nice and soldered up. So now we can take this bad boy and we can connect it. All right. So now we can connect this by dropping on some pre-tin here. And now we will connect the ESC to the PDB. There we go. Right? So now we have power, which, by the way, I know my XT60 is the wrong kind. It's the only one I had. We've got a motor hooked up to an ESC, hooked up to a PDB. Now we will take off the signal and the ground wire, and we'll show you how to properly get these soldered to your flight controller, and that's where we'll leave it. So you can't see, but these are very fine, small. Just need to pre-tin them very lightly. Now with these thinner wires, these are like 20 gauge, 22 gauge. You really want to drop the temperature down so you don't melt the shrink tubing on it, typically. So I've already dropped mine down. It's about 650 right now on this medium tip. But if I go any smaller, I don't know. I can go, not smaller, cooler. You can go a little cooler, but for me, I just work fast this way. So I've got a flight controller here. This one's a Siren. And we've pre-tinned the wires so we could actually stick them through the pinholes. So I'm just going to attach these randomly somewhere. So I'm actually going to go to the boot holes. So you want to pre-tin them to the point to where you can still get through the hole, but not so much tinning. Like this one's just a little thick. It's not wanting to go through the hole. And so I'm showing you the way. Oops. There we go. So you stick it through the hole, and then once it's, let's see if I can get this thing to focus for me. Once it's through the hole, there we go. You actually don't pre-tin that pad if you're trying to go through, because after it's through, you actually touch the pad and then try to tin the pad. And when you do, it'll coat the wire. It'll take the tinning off the wire and flow it into the pad, as well as that little bit that you added. So you can see, I don't know if you can see that, but that wire right there. Now, the other way to do it would be to actually just, if you did want to pre-tin or you already have tinned and you can't pull any off, the best way would be to actually, once again, just touch, pre-tin the pad, touch, let go, and now you've got a wire connected. So that's a way to just solder it to the top side if you want. Well, there you go. We now have all these components connected. I hope that helped. Yeah, fly safe, fly smart, fly for fun. Don't let soldering get to you, guys. Just practice, learn. You can do it. Peace.